There is a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Howard Schultz is standing in a supermarket aisle somewhere in America in the mid-1990s. He is the chief executive of Starbucks. He has spent a decade building something he genuinely believes in. And he is looking at a bag of his own coffee sitting on a shelf between Folgers and Maxwell House. Same fluorescent light. Same shelf height. Same aisle where people toss things in a trolley without really looking. He approved the deal himself. The numbers made sense. The revenue was real. But standing there in that aisle, something landed that the spreadsheet had not shown him. He was 7 years old when his father broke his ankle at a job delivering diapers. His father was fired immediately. No compensation. No health coverage. His mother was pregnant with their third child. Bill collectors called the house. Howard and his siblings were told to pick up the phone and say their parents were not home. He sat in that apartment listening to his parents try to hold things together with nothing, and he made himself a promise. He did not know yet what he would do with his life. But he knew, with the clarity that only a specific kind of childhood wound produces, that if he ever had the power to make a difference for the people who worked for him, he would use it. That promise is the operating system of everything that follows. He was the first in his family to go to college, on a football scholarship to Northern Michigan University. After graduating, he worked at Xerox, then moved to a Swedish housewares company called Hammerplast, where he became director of North American sales. In 1981, reviewing sales data, he noticed something strange. A small coffee bean shop in Seattle was placing unusually large orders for a particular drip coffee maker, far more than their size should have required. He flew out to investigate. The store was called Starbucks. It had 4 locations. He walked in and tasted the coffee, and something happened to him that he could not quite explain. He spent a year persuading the owners to hire him. He joined Starbucks as director of retail operations and marketing in 1982. He was 29 years old. He had a wife, Sherry, an interior designer he had married that year. He would say for the rest of his life that without Sherry, there would have been no Starbucks. Then you move to a country where the dominant bread product is a soft white loaf in a plastic bag, pre-sliced, built to last 3 weeks on a shelf. The bread still has calories. It fills the same role in the meal. But the experience of eating it is completely different from what you knew. That was Pete's relationship with American coffee in 1955. In 1966, he opened Pete's Coffee and Tea in Berkeley, California, and did 3 things no American coffee retailer had done before. He sourced beans directly from growing regions. He roasted them dark, drawing out the oils that light commercial roasting leaves behind. And he educated his customers, the way a great butcher tells you about the cut you are buying. This is why this bean tastes this way. This is what you are drinking. This is how to prepare it properly. His customers did not just buy coffee from Pete. They became converts to a completely different idea of what coffee could be. 3 young men in Seattle, Jerry Baldwin, Gordon Boker, and Zev Siegel, discovered Pete's in the late 1960s and were completely changed by it. They flew to Berkeley, spent time with Pete, learned everything he would teach them, and in 1971 opened the first Starbucks at Pike Place Market in Seattle, modeled almost entirely on what Pete had built. But here is what matters about the original Starbucks. It did not serve prepared drinks. It sold whole beans and equipment. The idea was that you would buy the beans, take them home, and make great coffee yourself. The store was a gateway to a private experience of superior coffee, not a place where the experience happened in public. The original founders were educators, not hosts. That distinction is everything. On the other side of the market sat Dunkin' Donuts, which had been serving cheap, fast, no-nonsense coffee since 1950. Their customer did not want an education. They wanted coffee in 90 seconds for less than $1. In through the door, out with the cup, back to the commute. Dunkin' was not wrong. Most coffee drinkers in America were their customer, not Pete's customer. What nobody had noticed was the gap between them. The coffee connoisseur was served. The person in a hurry was served. Nobody was serving the person who simply needed somewhere to be. Not a consumer being processed. Not a student being instructed. Just a person who wanted to sit with a good cup of coffee in a place that felt welcoming for as long or as short a time as they needed. That gap had no name yet. It was about to get one. The year is 1983. Schultz is 30 years old and in Milan for an international housewares trade show. The show itself is unremarkable. What is not unremarkable is the 15-minute walk from his hotel to the exhibition hall each morning. On the first morning, he stops at an espresso bar. Italian opera is playing. The barista is working two machines simultaneously with the economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times. An older man in a business suit walks in, says a few words in Italian, and within 30 seconds has an espresso in his hand and is deep in conversation with the barista about something Schultz cannot follow. The man is clearly irregular. The barista clearly knows him. This is not a transaction. It is a morning ritual performed between two people who know each other. Schultz visits the bar the next morning, and the next, he starts exploring different bars along different routes. He visits several in Verona on a day trip. At each one he sees the same pattern. The same faces arriving at the same hour, the same baristas who know their orders without being asked, the same sense that these people are not just buying coffee. They are arriving somewhere that belongs to their day. He wrote later, Starbucks had missed the point, completely missed it. This is so powerful. This is the link. I was shaking. He was shaking. That detail matters. This was not a gradual realization. It was a physical response to a gap he had suddenly seen with complete clarity. What the Italian espresso bar was selling was not coffee. It was belonging, the experience of being known in public, of having a place outside your front door that recognized you. And in America, in 1983, that place did not exist for most people. Think about your own morning. You have a home. You have a workplace. What is between them? For most Americans at the time, the answer was nothing. A drive-thru, a petrol station, a paper cup consumed in isolation. He flew back to Seattle and walked into Jerry Baldwin's office. He told him about Milan with the excitement of someone who has seen something that changes how they understand the world. He proposed that Starbucks start serving espresso drinks, that they create a gathering place rather than just a retail store. Baldwin said no. He was a roaster, not a restaurateur. Starbucks was an educational coffee company, not a coffee shop. The moment you cross into serving prepared drinks, you cross into food service, into labor costs, into a completely different operational model. Baldwin had been to Italy himself. He had seen the espresso bars. He just did not believe the cultural transfer would work in America. Schultz spent a year arguing. In April 1984, Baldwin gave him one concession, a small espresso bar inside Starbucks' sixth store at a corner in downtown Seattle. And on the first day, 400 customers came through. Baldwin looked at the numbers and said no again. He had already committed to buying Pete's. His focus was elsewhere. The test had succeeded and Schultz had still lost the argument. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. Baldwin was not a stupid man. He was not being obstinate for no reason. He knew Starbucks better than anyone. He understood coffee better than almost anyone in America. And that knowledge, that genuine deep expertise, was exactly what prevented him from seeing what Schultz was pointing at. Deep knowledge of what something is can become the ceiling on what it could become. The question is not whether you have the experience to evaluate an idea. The question is whether your experience is of the world as it is, or of the world as it could be. Schultz had no experience running a coffee chain. He had been in the job for a year, and he saw something that 16 years of expertise had missed. This is not a story about youth versus experience. It is a story about which question you are asking. Baldwin's question was, what is Starbucks? He answered it correctly. Schultz's question was, what does someone need that doesn't exist yet? He answered that correctly too. They were just not having the same conversation. But here's what comes next. Because proving the idea was not enough. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire story. Schultz left Starbucks in 1985. He was 32 years old. He had a vision that the most experienced coffee people in Seattle had rejected. He had no business of his own and no certainty that anyone would give him money to build one. He opened his own coffee company, 3 small coffee bars in Seattle and Vancouver that recreated, imperfectly but genuinely, the atmosphere he had witnessed in Milan. The stores worked. Customers returned. Multiple times a day. Then in 1987, something unexpected happened. The original Starbucks founders, struggling to manage both Starbucks and Pete's simultaneously, ran into financial difficulty and decided to sell the Seattle locations. They approached Schultz first. He had 60 days to raise $3,800,000. He raised half of it in 30 days. Then Baldwin called him in for a meeting. We have a competitive buyer, Baldwin said. One of your investors from your coffee company has shown up and offered me $4 million cash with no due diligence. Schultz knew immediately who it was. There were four titans of the Seattle business community in 1987. One of them, a man named Sam Straum, a prominent businessman and major civic figure, had been one of Schultz's original investors. He had gone directly to Baldwin behind Schultz's back, with a higher bid and no conditions. Schultz later said he felt the world had ended. He went home and told Sherry they were going to lose everything. A lawyer friend told him to come to his firm's offices the next morning and meet the senior partner. The senior partner was a man named Bill Gates Sr., father of the Microsoft founder. 6 feet 7 inches tall. One of the most respected figures in Seattle's legal and business community. Schultz had never heard of him. He told Gates the whole story. Gates listened. Then he said, "Come back in 2 hours." When Schultz returned, Gates stood up and said, "We're going for a walk." They crossed the street to an office building in Seattle. Gates walked into Sam Straum's office, leaned his enormous frame over the desk, and said, "I don't know what you are planning, but whatever it is, it's not going to happen. Howard Schultz is going to acquire the Starbucks coffee company, and he's never going to hear from you again." He walked out without waiting for a response. Schultz hurried after him into the corridor, stunned, and asked what had just happened. "He's going to stand down," Gates said, "and my son and I are going to invest." On the 15th of August, 1987, Schultz bought Starbucks for $3,800,000. 11 stores. I have thought about that walk across the street many times. Gates Sr. had no financial stake in Schultz's dream before that morning. He helped because the story was right, and because Schultz had spent years being someone worth knowing before he was ever someone who needed knowing. You cannot manufacture that moment when you need it. It is built in all the ordinary moments before. The rescue is almost never built at the moment of crisis. It is built in the years that come before it, in relationships that seem to have no immediate purpose, in being someone whose story a stranger feels compelled to protect. Step back from Schultz for a moment and think about your own network. Not the people you follow online. The people who would walk across a street for you at a moment of maximum need. How many of those relationships are you building right now, before you need them? That question is the real mechanism inside this story. And Schultz was now inside Starbucks. 11 stores. A name. A reputation for quality. And a vision that had been rejected for 3 years. He was about to find out whether it was actually right. It is 1988. Starbucks has been under Schultz's ownership for less than a year. The company is not profitable. The board is watching every dollar. Schultz calls a meeting and proposes something that makes the board deeply uncomfortable. Full health insurance, including dental and vision coverage, for every employee working 20 or more hours per week. Not just managers, part-time baristas too, which in a coffee chain means almost everyone. To understand why this was radical, you need to understand the retail labor market in 1988. Employee turnover ran at approximately 150% per year across the industry. In a store with 10 employees, you replaced 15 of them every 12 months. You were constantly hiring, constantly training, constantly losing the institutional knowledge that comes with people who know their regulars and know their products. The board's objection was mathematical. If you give benefits to people who leave after 3 months, you are paying for something they will never stay long enough to value. Schultz offered a different calculation. What if the benefit itself reduces turnover? What if treating people as though they matter, in an industry where the standard assumption is that they do not matter, changes the fundamental equation? He told the board why this was not abstract principle for him. When he was 7 years old, his father broke his ankle at work and was fired on the spot. No compensation, no health coverage. His mother was pregnant. Bill collectors called the house. He had made himself a promise in that apartment that he was keeping right now, in this meeting, with this board. In late 1988, Starbucks became the first major American retailer to offer comprehensive health benefits to part-time employees. 3 years later, on the day Starbucks opened its 100th store, Schultz stood in front of 700 people at the Seattle roasting plant and introduced Beanstalk. Every eligible employee would receive a grant of company shares in November each year. The grant vested over 2 years, half after year 1, half after year 2. To receive your shares, you had to stay. That last detail was the mechanism. Beanstalk was not primarily a compensation tool. It was a retention tool dressed as a compensation tool. A barista 18 months into their tenure had unvested shares worth real money sitting in an account. Leaving meant forfeiting them. The financial cost of leaving was now visible and specific, in a way that abstract loyalty to an employer never can be. Turnover at Starbucks fell to approximately 65%, less than half the industry average. The board had been right about the mathematics of high-turnover retail. Their model was accurate. What they were wrong about was which variable was fixed. They treated turnover as a constant of the industry and asked how to manage costs around it. Schultz treated costs as manageable and asked how to change turnover. One question accepts the world as it is. The other asks what the world could be. Today, Beanstalk is still in operation. In a recent year, more than 125,000 Starbucks partners received grants, with over $234 million in pre-tax gains going back to partners. Baristas have used it to buy their first homes, pay off university debt, cover medical emergencies. He called his employees partners, not as a marketing decision, because they were. Before we go further, I want to tell you about the written companion to this episode. Everything we are covering today, the 8 stories, the real mechanisms behind how Starbucks was built, the China strategy, the Beanstalk model in detail, the 2007 memo, and what it actually said, the boycott, and what Schultz would do differently in 2026. It is all in a 13,000-word written document that goes with this episode. It includes the scenes we are telling here told at full depth, the research behind each decision, and the principles written out so you can use them. The link is in the description below. For less than the price of a coffee. If you are the kind of person who listens to this, the document is worth having. By 1992, Starbucks had approximately 150 stores. The conventional advice was to wait before going public. Go public at 300 stores. At 400, build a larger proof of concept first. Schultz went public at 150, and his reasoning reveals something important about how he thought. He was not primarily raising capital. He was thinking about landlords. To open a Starbucks on the busy corner of a major city, you need the property owner to believe you will be there in 10 years. A publicly traded company is a different kind of entity from a promising private chain. It has regulatory obligations, a board with fiduciary duties, and a daily market price that functions as a public vote of confidence. The IPO was a credibility signal to the commercial real estate market. He was thinking about talent. The senior operators needed to build the supply chain and the international infrastructure he was already planning would not join a small private company for a salary and a promise. They needed equity with a mechanism for realizing value. He was thinking about brand. In 1992, Starbucks spent almost nothing on paid advertising. The IPO generated national press coverage on the day of the offering and for weeks afterward. It introduced Starbucks to people in cities where no store existed yet. The brand awareness created by the IPO preceded the physical expansion, which made each new store opening feel less like the arrival of an unknown entity and more like the arrival of something people had already heard about. Starbucks went public on the 26th of June, 1992. The stock opened at $21.50. Since the IPO, the stock has split 6 times on a 2-for-1 basis. The annualized return from the offering price to 2017, when Schultz stepped back as chief executive for the second time, was approximately 24% per year. But the number is not the point. The point is that Schultz understood something that most people building companies miss. The most powerful business moves are rarely what they appear to be on the surface. Going public looked like a financing event. It was actually a positioning event that changed what the company could do in 4 different markets simultaneously: real estate, talent, brand, and capital. Every major decision in a company's life carries primary effects and secondary effects. Most advisors optimize the primary. The founders who build lasting companies are often optimizing the secondary effects while everyone else is arguing about the primary. What is the decision in front of you right now that might be doing 3 things you haven't counted yet? Most people know the third place concept as a phrase. The coffee shop between home and work. They hear it and nod, as if naming the concept is the same as understanding it. It was not a brand concept. It was an operating system. Schultz had borrowed the language from a sociologist named Ray Oldenburg who had written about the importance of informal gathering places in building community: the pub, the barbershop, the piazza. Spaces that belong to everyone and no one at the same time, where people can be in public without the formality of work or the obligations of home. Oldenburg described what these spaces did. Schultz's insight was to build one at industrial scale. Every physical decision in a Starbucks store was stress-tested against one question. Does this make someone want to stay? The armchairs. Commercial seating in the coffee industry in the early 1990s was designed to process customers quickly. Hard chairs, small tables, no invitation to linger. Schultz put in armchairs, chairs you could sink into, chairs that said, without a word, there is no rush. The music. He hired a dedicated team to curate the in-store soundtrack. He eventually spun this into a separate entity called Hear Music, which became a full record label. The music was not background noise. It was atmosphere. The locations. Schultz personally selected the first 500 store locations. Not from behind a desk. He walked streets. He stood on corners for 20 minutes and watched foot traffic. He was looking for intersections where several streams of pedestrian movement crossed, where the store would be visible from the maximum number of directions, where someone walking any of several routes to work would pass it every day. Every person who walked past a Starbucks on their way to work was being marketed to. No advertising spend required. The building did the work. The decision not to franchise. This is the one that cost the most and arguably mattered the most. Franchising was the fastest and cheapest path to national scale. Schultz rejected it for the American market completely. His reasoning. Every element of the third-place experience depended on the people delivering it. A franchisee optimizes for their own financial return on their own investment, not for the feeling of a stranger walking through the door. You cannot franchise community. So Starbucks maintained company-owned stores even though the capital requirement was enormous and the debt load created tension with investors throughout the 1990s. He said it simply, "We are not in the coffee business serving people. We are in the people business serving coffee." That sentence is not a tagline. It is an organizational instruction. Every decision flows from it. When you define your business by what it produces, you will always be in competition with everyone who produces the same thing. When you define it by how it makes people feel, you occupy a category nobody else can fully replicate. You can copy the coffee. You cannot copy the atmosphere. Apple understood this with retail spaces. Airbnb understood it with hospitality. The question is whether you have built every operational decision around producing the feeling consistently, at scale, in stores you will never personally visit. That last part is the hardest part, and it is where everything eventually went wrong. The year is 2000. Schultz is 47. Starbucks has more than 3,000 stores in 13 countries. He steps back from the chief executive role and hands the company over. He tells himself he will not interfere. He was wrong about that. Under successive chief executives, Starbucks expanded at 5, 6, 700 new stores per year. By 2007, there were more than 13,000 locations. The revenue numbers were extraordinary. But Schultz, watching from the outside, was getting worried in a way he could not quite put numbers to. He walked into stores and saw things that troubled him. The espresso machines had been switched to fully automatic models. Faster, more consistent. But the barista used to steam milk in full view of the customer, tilting the pitcher at a precise angle, watching the surface for the particular shimmer that indicates the right temperature, creating a small visible performance of skill and attention. The automatic machine removed that entirely. It also meant the customer could no longer see the barista's face during preparation. The human connection had been designed out of the transaction. The coffee aroma had changed. Pre-ground, flavor-sealed packaging had taken the smell of coffee out of the air. The smell that used to hit you the moment you opened a Starbucks door was largely gone. The stores had been standardized for cost efficiency. Identical fixture packages. Streamlined designs cheaper to build and easier to maintain. Each individual decision had been rational. Together they had produced, as Schultz would later write, stores that no longer have the soul of the past and reflect a chain of stores versus the warm feeling of a neighborhood store. On Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, 2007, Schultz wrote an internal memo to the chief executive. He titled it The Commoditization of the Starbucks Experience. He wrote, "Over the past 10 years, in order to achieve the growth, development, and scale necessary to go from less than 1,000 stores to 13,000 stores and beyond, we have had to make a series of decisions that, in retrospect, have led to the watering down of the Starbucks experience and what some might call the commoditization of our brand. Many of these decisions were probably right at the time, but the sum is much greater and, unfortunately, much more damaging than the individual pieces. 9 days later, the memo leaked to a blog. The stock fell 8% in a week. Schultz waited for someone to act on it. Nobody did. Not seriously. Not with urgency. In the third quarter of 2008, for the first time in the company's history, Starbucks reported a net loss. Net earnings for the full year had collapsed to $316 million, down 53% from the prior year. The share price fell below $7. In September 2007, Schultz had met privately with the board. He was going back in. On the 8th of January, 2008, he returned as chief executive. 7 weeks later, on the 26th of February, 2008, he made the most dramatic single operational decision of his career. He closed all 7,100 American Starbucks stores simultaneously for 3.5 hours. The company lost $6 million in revenue that afternoon. Analysts called it theater. Investors called it unnecessary. 135,000 baristas relearned how to pull a correct espresso shot. And he told them something that day that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, "This is not about training. This is about the love and compassion and commitment that we all need to have for the customer." He was not fixing a process. He was restoring a belief system. 8 months later, in October 2008, the global financial system was in freefall. Starbucks was cutting costs everywhere it could. Schultz spent $30 million sending 10,000 senior managers to New Orleans for a 3-day leadership conference. The board fought him on it. He overruled the board. His argument: this is precisely when culture must be reinforced. When the world outside is most frightening, the people inside most need to feel that their company knows who it is. Net earnings in fiscal year 2009, $390 million. Fiscal year 2010, $945 million. A threefold increase from the low point in 2 years. He wrote later, "If you're really honest with yourself, as I have tried to be with myself, along the way in building the company, there has been something we have lost. And it's no one's fault, and there's no punishment or blame. We are what we are. But the question is, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to fix it?" That is the hardest leadership question there is. To look at extraordinary financial growth and say that something is wrong. To have the honesty to name a loss that nobody else can see in the numbers yet. Most leaders cannot do this because they have confused the performance of growth with the health of the business. Schultz separated them. He looked at 13,000 stores and a $10 billion revenue line and said, "The numbers are right and the soul is wrong. Think about what you are building right now. Not the metrics. The feeling. Does the thing you are making still feel like what you intended it to be?" In 1999, Starbucks opened its first store in Beijing. Coffee consumption in China at that time, approximately 4 cups per person per year. In the United States, around 400. The idea that a premium American coffee chain could build a significant business in a country with deep roots in tea culture was, by conventional analysis, speculative at best. Schultz made the bet anyway. Not because the coffee market data was compelling. Because he was watching something else. The emergence of a Chinese urban middle class with disposable income, ambition, and an intense interest in symbols of modernity. For this consumer, a Starbucks was not primarily a coffee shop. It was a destination. A place to hold a business meeting. A visible signal that you were a certain kind of person. The Chinese customer was not looking for the third place in the sense Schultz had understood in Milan. They were looking for status confirmation in a premium environment. That distinction required a completely different physical expression of the same underlying principle. Starbucks, China built larger stores than anywhere else in the world. More architectural ambition. Where an American Starbucks was designed to feel like a comfortable neighborhood, a Chinese Starbucks flagship in Shanghai was closer to a statement building. High ceilings, premium materials, design that invited both lingering and being seen. In 2011, Schultz hired a woman named Belinda Wong to lead China operations. Wong had been born in Hong Kong, raised partly in Washington state where her family ran a Chinese restaurant, and had been inside Starbucks since 1999. She understood both the company's values and the specific textures of Chinese consumer culture with a depth most Western executives in China could not match. Under her direction, the operation adapted in ways Seattle had not anticipated. She extended partner benefits to include critical illness insurance, not just for employees, but for their parents. In China, filial responsibility is not optional. It is the foundation of the social contract. A young person working at Starbucks has obligations to their parents as significant as obligations to themselves. By covering parents, Starbucks was not just adding a benefit. It was acknowledging the actual structure of its employees' lives. At an investor day in 2016, Schultz said, "Our business in China will be larger than our business in the United States." That statement was made at a moment when China was contributing a small fraction of U.S. revenue. It was a declaration of conviction about a trajectory, not a description of current reality. In 2017, Starbucks paid $1.3 billion to buy out its East China joint venture partners and take full ownership of those operations. By 2024, Starbucks China had more than 7,500 company-owned stores across 1,000 Chinese cities. China was contributing approximately 18% of global revenue. At its peak, a new Starbucks was opening in China every 15 hours. The principle that built Starbucks in Seattle, a welcoming space where people feel at home, was universal. The American coffee house format was one expression of it. Belinda Wong found the Chinese expression. The principle held. The form changed completely. This is the discipline that separates global brands from regional ones. You have to know the difference between the principle and the expression of it. You have to be willing to change the expression completely while holding the principle absolutely. Most companies get this wrong in one of two directions. They export the format unchanged and wonder why it doesn't work. Or they adapt so completely that the principle gets lost in the localization and the brand loses its identity. Schultz held both. That is harder than it sounds. Now let me tell you about that supermarket aisle. Because we started there, and it is time to return. In the mid-1990s, with Starbucks expanding rapidly and the board looking for additional revenue channels, Schultz approved a deal to distribute pre-packaged Starbucks coffee through supermarkets. The whole bean product already existed. The roasting infrastructure was in place. The brand was strong enough to command a premium on a grocery shelf. The revenue opportunity was real. The initial numbers were good. That made it harder to see the problem. And then he walked into a supermarket and stood in the coffee aisle. Starbucks bag. Folgers on the left. Maxwell House on the right. Same fluorescent light. Same shelf. Same aisle where people toss things into a trolley without really looking. The brand he had built on theater, on belonging, on the warmth of a neighborhood that knew your name, was now positioned as a commodity. The product had not changed. The context had changed everything about what it communicated. He had made the same mistake he would later write about in the memo. Individually rational decisions accumulating into something that could only be seen from the outside when it was already done. The resolution came in 2018. Starbucks struck a global licensing agreement with Nestlé worth $7.15 billion, giving Nestlé the rights to sell Starbucks consumer packaged goods worldwide. The structure this time recognized what the earlier arrangements had missed. The retail store experience and the packaged goods business were different brand territories. They had to be managed differently. Every distribution decision is also a brand decision. Where your product lives tells the customer who your product is for. The context around your product shapes its meaning more powerfully than the product itself. This is a trap that almost every successful brand walks into. The individual expansion moves look rational. The aggregate effect is lethal. When you are on every supermarket shelf in the world, you are no longer a destination. You are an option. Before we get to where things stand today, there is one more thing I want to say about how Howard Schultz actually thought. Because the story has two halves, and you need both of them. The first half. In 1988, with the company not yet profitable, with the board fighting him, Schultz gave comprehensive health insurance to part-time baristas because of what happened to his father in a Brooklyn apartment when he was 7 years old. That connection between a childhood wound and a company policy is one of the most direct lines I have found in any founder story. He was not performing progressive values. He was honoring a specific promise made to a specific person at a specific moment. That is the first half. The second half. Beginning in late 2021, a union movement spread through Starbucks stores. First in Buffalo, then across the country. The workers asking for union recognition were not asking for anything that contradicted what Schultz had said Starbucks stood for. They were asking for predictable scheduling, for wages that kept pace with costs, for a voice in the conditions of their work. These were the demands of people who had heard, "We are partners for decades," and wanted to know if it was true. The company's response involved legal tactics that were widely criticized, store closures in markets where union activity was growing, and a Senate hearing in which Schultz was questioned for hours about practices that bore no resemblance to the values in his books. I am not going to resolve that contradiction for you. I do not think it can be resolved cleanly. What I will say is this. The origin story that served Schultz as a decision-making tool for 40 years, his father's broken ankle, the family with nothing to fall back on, became in those years a rhetorical frame that was being used to defend decisions his father would not have recognized. That distance between the stated values and the demonstrated ones is the most important part of the Howard Schultz story. Not because it cancels what came before, because it makes what came before honest. A founder who is only the good parts of their story is not a founder. They are a myth. Howard Schultz is a man. Let me tell you where things stand today. As of 2025, Starbucks operates more than 36,000 stores across 87 countries. Annual revenue, approximately $36 billion. 350,000 employees worldwide. By every conventional measure, one of the most successful consumer brands ever built. It is also, right now, under genuine pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. In the United States, the average time between ordering and receiving a drink has lengthened significantly as the menu has grown. A customer ordering a drink with 12 modifier requests creates a preparation sequence that backs up the entire line for everyone behind them ordering simpler things. The operational friction has made the store feel, for a growing number of people, less like a place to belong and more like a queue to manage. The third place has been quietly replaced by a pickup window and spirit, even when the physical space remains. In China, a company called Luckin Coffee, which had collapsed in 2020 after an accounting fraud scandal, came back. By 2023, it had more than 13,000 stores in China, nearly double the Starbucks footprint. Luckin's model, smaller stores, lower prices, app-first ordering, was designed for a mass-market customer that Starbucks' premium positioning was not targeting. Starbucks refused to enter the price war. Probably the right brand decision. Also a concession of the mass market, which is where the volume growth in Chinese coffee was happening. And then in October 2023, the company's own union posted a message of solidarity with Palestine on social media. Starbucks sued the union. The lawsuit became the spark for a consumer boycott that spread rapidly across the Middle East and Muslim-majority markets globally. The Starbucks MENA franchisee, which operates more than 1,900 locations across 11 regional markets, fired approximately 2,000 employees as revenue declined. More than 50 stores closed in Malaysia and Morocco. Starbucks lost approximately $11 billion in market value across the period of peak boycott intensity. The chief executive at the time described the situation as really unfortunate and attributed it to inaccurate information. The boycott continues in various markets. What would Howard Schultz do in 2026? He would cut the menu aggressively. Not surgically, aggressively, back to the core drinks that made the experience coherent. He would accept the short-term revenue hit to stop the operational degradation. He knows from 2008 that the willingness to lose money in the short term to protect the experience is the only signal the organization will believe. He would walk the stores, not the flagships, the ordinary stores in ordinary neighborhoods at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. He would stand at the counter and feel the experience as a first-time customer feels it. Then he would come back and write a memo. He would try to close the union gap from the inside rather than fight it from outside. His entire career was built on the premise that a company could treat its workers with enough genuine dignity that collective bargaining would feel unnecessary. Whether that premise can still hold in 2026, given everything that has happened in the past 3 years, is genuinely uncertain. But his instinct would be to try. And I think he would finally say, honestly, the thing he never quite said publicly. The most important thing I did not do was build the systems that would allow this culture to survive my absence. The same drift happened when I left in 2000. It happened again when I left in 2017. The third repetition is not a coincidence. It is a structural problem I never fully solved. A company that can only be itself when its founder is in the building is not an institution. It is a personality. The goal, the thing he never quite achieved, is a company that knows who it is without needing to be told every morning. Here is what I want to leave you with. Howard Schultz did not build Starbucks by having a vision. Lots of people have visions. He built it by making thousands of individual decisions over 36 years, each one filtered through a question he had been carrying since he was 7 years old. What does it feel like when someone treats you as if you do not matter? That question produced the health insurance, the beanstalk, the armchairs, the locations on the busy corners, the refusal to franchise, the closing of 7,000 stores on a Tuesday afternoon for 3.5 hours. It also produced the contradiction. Because the same question, if you stop asking it honestly, stops being a guide and starts being a brand identity. And that is when the gap opens. The lesson is not that Schultz was a hero or a hypocrite. The lesson is that the origin story is only as good as the daily practice of asking the question again. Not once, at the founding. Every time there is a decision to make. Every time the numbers are pulling you one way and the answer to that question is pulling you another. He was right about the question. He was not always right about the answer. That is probably the most honest thing you can say about any founder. The written companion to this episode is a 13,000-word document covering all 8 stories at full depth, the beanstalk model in detail, the China expansion, and how Belinda Wong rebuilt the third place for Chinese consumer culture, the 2007 memo, and exactly what it said, the full arc of the 2008 return, the empire today, and what Schultz would do differently in 2026. It is the kind of document worth keeping. The link is in the description below. For less than the price of a coffee. If this episode was worth your time, I would be genuinely grateful if you shared it with one person who would find it useful. Not a post. One person. The channel grows one conversation at a time, and that is how I want it to grow. There is a reading list at the end of the written document, but the 2 books worth your time are Pour Your Heart Into It, Schultz's 1997 memoir written with Dory Jones-Young, and Onward, his 2011 account of the return. Pour Your Heart Into It is the one that feels most alive. He wrote it while he was still building, before he knew how the story would end. That energy is in every page. Thank you for listening to Builder's Codex.